All right, welcome to week 6, guys. And in this week, we're going to be talking about the rising expectation. Last week, we looked at what was life like in parts of the colonies as it related to what was what was slavery like, the institution of slavery, like in different parts of in the southern colonies, like the low country, they were treated a little bit different, or they responded to different certain situations in the Chesapeake, different kind of way of working and so forth. And then we also saw kind of the becoming of African American, taking some African traditions and mixing them with these new things that they were learning that was foreign to them, right? And so we saw that. And so here we are as the institution of slavery was implemented in America or in the colonies at this time. We are now where America is also competing against their mother country. There were some things that were taking place at the time that was affecting the colonies, and they were beginning to fight for this freedom that they believed in. And so in this chapter, we're going to see that not from we're going to look at it with it tied in with the freedom that was fought in the American Revolution, but what African Americans even saw and what they were thinking about it at that same time. So we know, right, the Declaration of Independence was written. It had gotten up to a point where the colonies just couldn't deal with the situation at hand. King George, after the French and Indian War, began to implement these taxes that were affecting the colonies, and so they were talking about you can't tax us and not give us representation within government. That was one of their major. So no taxation without representation. So eventually it boiled to a point, and after the first two battles that happened, Battle of Lexington and Concord and the Battle of Bunker Hill, they now are like, yep, we have to begin. So the Declaration of Independence um, is now being written by Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson writes out this list of grievances against the king and what he saw or what they were seeing that the king was doing was wrong. And so the Continental Congress adopts the Declaration of Independence. So this is where now they want to be independent of who they are connected to, which was Britain. And so African Americans, those who were free and were intellectuals, were also looking at the same thing. They heard about and read the Declaration of Independence, and they believed war for independence would be a war against slavery. So they were thinking that this new country was only implementing what Britain was about. And so that this new country, after they would fight this war, African Americans were thinking, well, if we help them fight, they will see that, we are Americans and they will give us this freedom. And so the Patriots made unqualified claims for human equality and natural rights in there, right? And when you look at the Declaration of Independence. So African Americans will force the whites to confront this contradicting new ideal versus reality. And so the white Americans will have this choice, of they're speaking on one hand an independence from a tyrannical king, but here they are implementing the same things that they felt that they were being subject to. And so this is so important. A lot of times we don't talk about this. Really, the first revolutionary of this war was Crispus Attucks, who was an African American, who went to speak out about freedom, but it cost him his life. So here is a great example of someone fighting for a cause they believe in, even if it means death. So here's our first revolutionary in America. So we want to talk about other revolutionaries as it relates to the African American community. We need to begin to really give Crispus Attucks his props. He's the first revolutionary to fight for a thing that may or may not come. And so we know the Declaration of Independence and even the colonists, were being affected by the Enlightenment era that happened in Europe. And so as the Enlightenment really influenced the group we would call patriots, because they were looking at their ideology, and their ideology creates this age of revolution. For example, when Isaac Newton writes The Principle of Mathematics, he used mathematics to portray orderly universe run by natural laws and discover everything through reason. So here is that thought that reason should say to the new country that's fighting for independence that they should give independence to everyone, because they wrote in their own paper, all men are created equal. I guess as we go through, we will have to ask, did they really mean that? Or was that what we call propaganda to move into a space that they saw for themselves? And so, as Isaac Newton, John Locke applied Newton's concept to politics, because he said everybody has a natural right to life, liberty, and property. Remember, England was all about land. Land was liberty. Land meant freedom. But we know in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson changes it to the pursuit of happiness. And whether we agree that Thomas Jefferson really write those things, and we know that the African American community throughout historical time in America, still to this day, are always being subjected to opposition, being in front of them, always fighting to get a space, to be in something, to be an American. Whether he meant that, if we truly understand where we are today as it relates to 2021, we all have access to the pursuit of happiness. But you're going to have to define that for yourself. What is happiness for you? Is it your own? Or is it something you're borrowing from someone else? You have to think about these things. So we can depict and pull and talk about and say and do all of these things. But at this moment, I need you to stop. What is your pursuit of happiness? Is it the degrees you guys are going for? Is it sitting in my African American history class? What is your pursuit of happiness? And how do you get there? And what does it look like when you put it down on paper? And so this contradiction in the treatment of African Americans is going to be interesting. And so as the revolutionary debate went on, African Americans were optimistic that they would see the contradiction in the things that they were saying and place that on this institution of slavery. Even some English and white Americans pointed out the contradiction and wanted to help improve the situation for black people in the North and some of those in the Upper South. But the African Americans will see in certain situations they're going to have to act on their own behalf. And so, for the quest of freedom, some will go to court and win their liberty. And as black men adopted the revolutionary rhetoric and will begin to petition state legislators for emancipation, it is at this moment black men were also in the fight with others, like demonstrating against the Stamp Act and served with white Minutemen. And so that's why we got to give Crispus Attucks his credit. Here is a man looked upon not as an equal, but because of ideals, because of this moment could be revolutionary, goes out and tries. And so as the Enlightenment will begin to shape careers of America, we will begin to see black intellects. One such will be like Phyllis Wheatley, who will learn how to write poetry, and her book will be distributed across the colonies. We will see some like in science, like Benjamin Banneker. I remember my first African American history class on the campus of DSU. And I asked the students, have they ever heard of Benjamin Banneker? And they didn't know who he was. And for me, that kind of threw me back a little bit, because what I know about Benjamin Banneker is, number one, he wrote a Farmer's Almanac. Number two, he was born in slavery, but was able to be educated. And he was an astronomer. But one of the most important things that I think Benjamin Banneker really contributed to America is George Washington and Lafayette were friends, and they were drawing up the plans to build Washington, D.C., the one you see today. And they got in an argument, and Lafayette took the blueprints back to France with him. And so Washington was sitting there not knowing how to build Washington, D.C. Benjamin Banneker remembered it by memory. So see, he was the son of a mixed race, mother of an African father. He inherited a farm from his white grandmother, where he was able to get steady income. He was attending racially integrated schools. He learned Latin and Greek. He became very interested in the mechanics. He would become the first black civilian employee of the U.S. government. And we do see where he had conversations with Jefferson. As Jefferson was writing the Declaration of Independence. And he was speaking to Jefferson about the contradictions. And they were real intense letters between Benjamin Banneker and Jefferson. Because he was telling Jefferson, yeah, you say these words, but you're not implementing these. You believe that blacks are inferior and whites are superior. Jefferson will say this out of his mouth. And so it's interesting where on one hand, They speak about the ills happening to them. But Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner himself, so how much of the Declaration of Independence left to be said? And so we know the two groups. The patriots are the people who were now fighting for freedom, fighting for liberty. And the loyalists were the people who were still loyal to the king. And so these two groups live near each other. And so the African Americans will join whoever will offer them freedom. In the beginning, George Washington didn't want any blacks in the Continental Army. And so Britain saw that and said, oh, we'll use them and we will give you freedom. So many blacks were like, all right, fight with you. We're fighting for whoever's going to grant us freedom. They knew that much. And when we look at the American indigenous people, they typically always fought with the British. So we will also see where British will recruit the African Americans because many of them were seeking protection from the British countries. So where you will see a lot of black loyalists, they will be in the low countries of South Carolina and Georgia. And Lord Dunham will issue the proclamation offering to liberate slaves who joined the British. And more African Americans were loyalists than patriots during the war. But when Britain lost the war, they could no longer stay. So you will see these groups of black British subjects now will move up into Nova Scotia. And still today, that group is a part of that indigenous group that went up to Nova Scotia. The Black Patriots will finally get an opportunity to fight with the colonists, now America. And when Dunmore will use the African American soldiers, Washington reconsidered. And so the state began to fill quotas for the Continental Army with black men. And they will serve in integrated units, not unions, but units. And so this War of Independence, African Americans were looking for their freedom as well. A lot of the African Americans were willing to risk their life. And the Enlightenment, rationalization, and the powerful anti-slavery forces will be important. Because many of them were beginning to see, like up in the North, that's why a lot of them moved up into the North, that slavery wasn't the common theme like it is in the South. And so the Chesapeake will emancipate. The sentiment as it begins to grow in the Low Country, white commitment to blacks. Bondage remain, absolutely. And so as this abolitionist movement among white Americans, the Quakers, and please hold on to the Quakers because the Quakers are instrumental in the Underground Railroad, in these societies of friends where they will help people like Harriet Tubman be successful. And so we see a person like Benjamin Lax, a former slaveholder, persuade friends to stop owning and buying slaves. And we will see where here are whites who were fighting for a moral issue. And as the revolutionary impact, it'll improve the prospect of African Americans. The war for independence dealt heavy and a mortal blow to slavery. The Chesapeake and the North, individual slaves gained freedom in return for service for the war, become masters who embraced the Enlightenment principles. And the war, the hastening decline of tobacco cultivation, was the impact of the Revolutionary War. So the promises that many of the African Americans heard. A lot of these newly freed African Americans lived in the Chesapeake. We will see a black class, free black class in South Carolina and Georgia. Fairly small. A lot of these free Africans will move into cities. And newly freed black at this moment. Now we're talking about newly freed meaning within this moment because there's a war going on. Face economic difficulties. And so we will see this challenges, but even though with these challenges, free African Americans will fight to stop enslavement. And some will take new names to signify freedom. So this is what North America looks like after the American Revolution. Remember, the 13 colonies only started on the eastern seaboard, but now you see they have land all the way up to the Mississippi River. And then the French used to have the Louisiana Territory, but it's now French and Spanish owned. And so in this conclusion, what we learned today was, as the United States was speaking and living off of the Enlightenment ideology, and they created this age of revolution to break away from their mother country because of the things King George was implementing within the colonies and not giving them representation. And so this freedom that they are seeking is a freedom that African Americans will link themselves to get themselves out of their situation. But America will be very contradictory because they will ask for freedom on one hand, but will deny freedom to someone on the other hand. And so this American Revolution will only be for a breakaway to create a whole new country. And when that country has this opportunity to make amends and not be like its old country, they'll drop the ball. But African Americans, up to that point, right now, they have not been let down yet. So they will hold on to this ideal of freedom for themselves. Thank you for listening.